Welcome to this session and collaboration between ONS and Norwegian Energy Partners, the leadership discussion about how oil majors can contribute to offshore wind. And it's a follow-up of the interview you might have seen with Giles, Dickson, the CEO of Wind Europe, just before this session. And with us today, my name first and foremost is Jon Dugstad. I'm with Norwegian Energy Partners, heading up the wind practice. With us today as panelists, we have Ms. Beate Myking, who is Senior Vice President for New Energy Solutions at Equinor. She has a long background in oil and gas, and for the last couple of years with the New Energy Solutions, and now technology head at that division. Then we have Mr. Giles Dickson, as you was just mentioned. He is the CEO of Wind Europe, so he has a slightly different approach to the questions we have about the oil majors than the oil majors themselves. And we have Mr. Olivier Terneaud, who is the VP Offshore Wind at Total, also with a project director responsibility. But he also has a long journey in offshore wind from ENGIE at an earlier stage. Long background in offshore wind with recent oil and gas major experience. Jenneke Verhoef, our last panelist, is with Shell. She's general manager for technical offshore wind there. And she's been there for a year as well, with a background earlier from RWE Energy in Germany. Now, with that, I want to take us to the first question for today. And I think I will turn it a bit around. Not only how can oil majors contribute to offshore wind, but how and what kind of advantages do you as an oil major think you have in offshore wind? Why? And what are the your competitive edge in offshore wind? Please, Jenneke, maybe we can have some comments to that.
I think there are a couple of obvious ones. Obviously, you can hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you excellently.
Okay, perfect. So obviously the presence in offshore oil and gas for the past 50 years and the knowledge that's there and the technical expertise of a lot of capabilities can be transferred to offshore wind, structural engineering, civil engineering, offshore engineering, to name a few. But I think there's also a couple that might not be so straightforward or visible. And I think I've experienced it myself when I was working for the past, before joining Shell, I've worked 14 years for German and Dutch utilities, where offshore wind was considered high risk business, whereas with my interview at Shell, it was considered very low risk. And I think that was for me also a new perspective, to think about how these big oil and gas companies, what kind of work they've been doing offshore, drilling thousands of meters depth to oil and so on, not knowing if you're actually going to find something. So the risk appetite is very different. And that's, I think, a key difference in understanding the way these companies do business, and I think that's also a benefit. So the risk appetite is there, but also the capability of managing these large-scale projects, and they're becoming more larger as we see in the offshore wind business. We're increasing scale. I think that's a big advantage, as well as the global presence that these oil majors already have. So I think that's something that we can leverage, and where we can also contribute a lot to this business going globally.
That's very interesting, and I think, Beate, maybe you can add something to that, particularly in terms of risk perception or risk appetite, also with your background from health and safety in Equinor.
Yes, but I very much echo what Jenneke is saying, but managing risk is something that we have worked with in decades, potential high-risk operations that we've been running at sea. And over time, the oil and gas sector has developed a distinct safety culture, I would say. And I think one of the major learnings that we can bring across, in addition to what's been mentioned, is how we do the safety work, where I experience that we can plug that directly into our offshore wind operations. But having said that, there is a lot of very good safety work and standards going on already in the wind industry. But what I do see is a different culture than in oil and gas, lacking the more systematic way of doing it, like experience transfer across the industry, for example. And in contrast, sharing incidents and learn across is a given in the oil and gas industry. And oil and gas comes with, from my experience, clearer expectations, better reporting culture, and follow up, and also, as I said, the way we share learnings. But all, I believe, are important to transfer, which we work with as well, trying to open up a bit on the sharing side for offshore wind. Thank you.
Olivier, with your background from NG, both at the gas side of it, I think, and also on offshore wind, of course, sharing of experiences and the size of the risk might be very different in terms of risk appetite within offshore wind versus in the oil and gas sector. What's your perception on that? And are there other advantages you see in terms of your position as a global oil major for offshore wind, advantages for yourself?
Yeah, so being the third to talk is now the list is quite complete. And clearly, what has most surprised me arriving at Total 6 months, 1 year ago, is definitely the impact of the global footprint. Working previously for NG, which is already a global company, we were not afraid going abroad, but working in Total, I can see that doing business in China or even Korea, for instance, going in Korea was another company would be thought as exotic. But when I came with with investment file to the ExCom, yeah, Korea is an OECD country, is a country where we are building FPSO. So yeah, what's the deal? What is the problem? And it was we had no country risk premium in our investment case, for example. So definitely global footprint, global supply chain. Again, on the Seagreen project, we are manufacturing jackets abroad in Dubai and Korea. For other European projects, it was thought to be, let's say, risky to manufacture jackets abroad, so outside Europe. But from a Total perspective, it's a challenge. We have to be, especially in the middle of the COVID crisis, it's a challenge, but it's not new boundaries or new frontiers.
I can hear at least the
That's excellent. I think, Giles, we still have a problem in terms of your voice there. So I think we'll just continue, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry, I've tried again. It's not working then, John, no?
Now we can hear you.
But do you hear me well?
Yes, so far.
Ah.
Hey, that sounds great.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Not a problem at all. I'm disconnecting.
Thank you. Many apologies. But don't let me interrupt the discussion. Olivier was in full flow, I think.
I wanted to touch on a couple of issues you mentioned in the interview. You said also that oil majors might bring more acumen to community engagement.
Yes.
As well as to maritime spatial planning in terms of being used to working with other participants in the sea.
Indeed.
We haven't heard that from Jenneke, Beate, or Olivier. Would you say something about it yourself? And then we might have their reaction to that as well.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. Look, the oil and gas majors, through their extensive investments in offshore infrastructure over many decades, have built up a wealth of experience and expertise in how to coexist happily with other economic and societal stakeholders that have an interest in the sea space that they are using. And here I mean the shipping industry, the fishing industry, military interests, and biodiversity interests. In the offshore wind industry, we are grappling with these challenges, not least as we increase our footprint. Remember, we have only 23 gigawatts today, and the EU wants us to have 450 gigawatts in Europe of offshore wind by 2050. So the maritime spatial planning challenge is going to become huge. And the expertise of the oil and gas majors in how to get along with the shipping, fishing, military and biodiversity interests is hugely useful to us. You mentioned communities. This is, of course, coastal communities, people in ports, the onshore communities, towns that have benefited from the offshore oil and gas industry for many years. Many such towns around the North Sea in particular are already benefiting from offshore wind. And I think something the oil and gas majors have done very successfully is to get societal buy-in from those communities in those coastal towns. Yeah, so that the people feel strongly linked to and associated with the industry, even if they're not working directly in it. And that's another area where we're really keen to tap in to the experience of the oil and gas majors. Of course, there are many other areas. Health and safety, we've mentioned already, absolutely crucial. The track record and credibility of the oil and gas majors in how to operate at sea with complex, large physical infrastructure and how to do so safely. That's a huge asset now that is coming into the offshore wind industry. Of course, there's then technology and know-how. A number of you have mentioned floating offshore wind. You bring expertise there with other floating offshore infrastructure. Equinor already deploying this directly, of course. Jenneke, you mentioned it too, and Olivier, you are developing your floating project in the Celtic Sea. And there's clearly some knowledge that the offshore wind industry can tap into there. It really benefits us having companies like yourselves and others coming in. Quite apart, of course, from all of the capital for investment and your large balance sheets, which you are mobilizing for the huge investments we need to deliver this scale up of offshore wind.
Giles, I think I will touch on the global sizes and the technology and supply chain development at the later stage. But I want to ask these other guys about community engagement or maritime spatial planning. Of course, you are used to having many participants in the sea, but and community engagement. How do you see, and some of you are from the utility side, so is there a big difference between how Shell or Total approaches community engagement than in the utilities? Do you see a big difference, or how do you work with this?
Yeah, so I can comment to that maybe a little bit.
Okay.
So definitely there's a big difference there, I would say. Of course, utilities do it on a very local basis as well, because power is has been a very local business so far. But I think also from the interview with Giles, which was very interesting, that what's happening currently is now wind farms are getting, for example, their grid connection point by point. And we need that integrated. If we really want to bring the offshore wind industry forward, and we want to accomplish the scale that's in the ambitions of so many countries, we need to team up and we need to look at it holistically and to see what makes sense. I think in the US alone, there are studies that, you know, if you would look at a DC grid out there out of the coast, you would save hundreds of millions of dollars already, instead of every wind farm acting on their own at the moment. And I think this is something where oil and gas has been a lot better in not in teaming up with an industry as such, to see where we can both serve communities and help support economic developments in the areas and so on. And that's something that I think those learnings will be very relevant for the offshore wind industry. And I think what's happening as well, and what I think is really good, is that a lot of governments are also focusing on that local content element in their auctions and so on. So it will be a criteria in any case in many countries already as well. But you have to coexist, otherwise, yeah, we won't be able to make it work. I think you're still on mute, John.
Yeah, that's I'm still learning. So Olivier, what's your position on that, with your background also from NG? You know, are there differences in how you approach community engagement?
Yeah, definitely. I would tend to say that the pressure is not the same. Anyway, the oil and gas majors are under very strong social pressure, much more than utility. Yeah, for what I know about utilities, is they feel some pressure, but it's much more local pressure, whereas for global oil and gas players, we are, let's say, everybody looks at us, so we must reach higher standards than what utility could do. And on top of that, when we are the offshore wind business has much higher cost pressure than the oil and gas business. So I know that the oil and gas colleagues are under cost pressure, but clearly knowing the two businesses, we can say that we have to achieve a much higher, let's say, cost saving. And when a company like Total or any other major comes to a utility, to a local community, they see us with the deep pockets. So let's say it's a bigger challenge doing renewables, being a major.
Beate, maybe you can answer a bit to that. You have a long background in Equinor has a long history in offshore wind now, since 2010, I think, almost. So you've been doing community engagement locally in the UK, at least, US, and now also in other regions. Is it different in offshore wind, or are oil companies perceived differently than utilities in your experience? Is there something you can add to that?
Actually, I'm not quite sure about that, if we're kind of looked upon differently, but I hear what my peers are saying, but definitely we engage in the communities along, for example, at the coastline of Norfolk and also further north in Scotland, and it's the way, if we can have any projects together or in any way kind of help with local initiatives. And we also do STEM initiatives in the UK. And then also Giles mentioned fisheries, and we have worked many years together with the fisheries to find the right solutions. And it's a big, it's always important to see if we can find common grounds and how we can develop together in the maritime space. But yes, I feel that we do engage in local communities. I cannot say that we have higher pressures because we're an oil and gas major, but that is an experience I cannot, I don't know about, to be honest. Jon, you're muted.
There we go. Now, interesting, Beate, very good to hear, and from Jenneke and Olivier as well. What we are really talking about is the competitive edge that you might have in terms of your positioning within offshore wind. And it seems like your experience, at least in terms of community engagement, might be wider because you have a larger or more global reach and have experienced this from a variety of localities. Is there any way you discuss this with the industry? I mean, Giles is here with us, and of course, the industry as such might benefit from your experience with the community engagement, HNS, or also maritime spatial planning efforts, which might be more of a governmental issue, though. But is there any joint efforts? Giles, maybe you can talk a bit to that.
So I can share with you all that Shell and Equinor, as members of Wind Europe, are actively sharing their good practice and know-how on health and safety at sea. I think it would be good for us also through Wind Europe to share the good practice and experience on community engagement. I think a lot of, even some of the established utility operators in offshore wind would welcome that. It's very interesting listening to all of you, Olivier, Beate, and Jenneke, what you're saying on the cost pressures and the challenges that you face when you come into the sector now. I wonder, and this is a question to the three of you, how is it in terms of the baggage and the reputation that you bring into our industry as oil and gas majors? Do you feel that in some countries or in some parts of the value chain you are viewed with suspicion because of where you are coming from? I hope it's not an inappropriate question for me to be asking you.
Thanks, Giles, for that good question. Is there anyone who would like to
so I can
have a comment on that?
maybe start with some thoughts that are coming up in my mind. I don't think there's a one answer fits all for this question. So I think it's globally very differently how Shell's perceived. So for example, their reputation in the Netherlands is a very different one than in the US. Yeah. So yeah, if it comes with baggage and reputation, I think in particular the already established industry is looking at the oil majors and as they've got deep pockets, and what will that do to the industry? So there's a certain fear or respect, or I don't know how to properly mention that, but there's that, I think, a view of the companies. But nevertheless, we also need to reach a certain business result and a business case, obviously. So in that sense, it is still a very cost competitive business we're in. I think what is a disadvantage for companies like Shell or Total, Equinor, is that we're still perceived as oil and gas companies. And if we're looking at, in particular, young engineers and new talent that's coming into the markets, they are hard to, they're maybe not willing to work for an oil and gas company anymore. So I think there's a lot of a trend in taking social responsibility and also acquiring that best talent to make the energy transition happen. So I think that's probably where I see a bigger reputational risk, where we need to tell the story straight, right? So we are a big part of the energy transition, and if you really want to impact, that was for me personally as well a reason to move to Shell. If you really want to have an impact, this is actually where you need to be and where to make it happen. And that's, I think, a story that we also need to tell, that it's also a coexistence with oil and gas, and where the oil and gas sector is also very much paying for all these investments, and local communities, and the opportunity for offshore wind to become an industry at even larger scale.
Beate, I think you had a comment to that as well.
Yes, thank you. No, I very much agree with what's being said here. I think it differs in what kind of geographies that we engaging, but I think it is important to also we engage in projects, and that's very often very positive also for the local communities. They see that there might be local jobs there, and there are possibilities. So it's important to show that we have a serious transition as well, and that we create opportunities, but definitely extremely important to be humble in the way we go develop our industry from and the transition. So just wanted to mention that.
Maybe I can turn that discussion in a slightly different direction, because we have another 20 minutes, and I'd like to touch on something which I think that all the viewers might have some interest in. And you had mentioned, Olivier, that you have a global reach and you're building a global supply chain. And of course, your impact on the suppliers and the supply chain might be similar. And the position or anxiety maybe on the supplier side, or excitement, depending on which way you see it, might be differently towards a big global player like one of the oil majors than to one of the utilities. Do you, and how you work with suppliers, not least. Maybe Olivier, you want to comment on that in terms of how do you work with suppliers on a global scale? And will your way of doing things in oil and gas have an impact on how you build your supply chain in offshore wind as well?
Yeah, this is actually one of those things which has surprised me arriving at the time 1 year ago. There are some suppliers which are common between oil and gas and offshore wind. But the order of magnitude of the contracts are clearly not the same. Let's say an installation contract of 100 million euro is an interesting contract in the offshore wind sector, but can be a rather small one when you are building an oil and gas platform. So there are some contractors to whom we are buying every year billions of dollars of contract, and so we are quite sure they are not going to behave improperly for the offshore wind offshore project, because the leverage can be really large thanks to the oil and gas part. So that's a very good surprise, and that is very, very useful. I don't know how the colleagues do feel on this part.
Yeah, maybe I just have a follow-up question on that. Will that have an impact on pricing?
More than pricing, what is really important is the risk. It has, let's say, on the risk assessment, clearly that you are going to be delivered your goods, and you are going to have the boats in due time, which is the most important stuff, and where you can lose millions and millions if the boat is not there.
Can I just also chip in, Jon?
Please, Beate.
I think there is an interesting difference when we talk about oil and gas majors. It seems that we have a kind of a stronger foothold in different geographies and more globally. than maybe some of our of the pure renewables, which oil and gas majors can leverage on. And Olivier has mentioned some examples that are the same, but maybe our geographical footprint can help spread offshore winds maybe a bit faster than without these companies present. And there is also another interesting experience from my side, and that is I think that oil and gas industry has, or oil majors have more hands in with the supplier industry, having more multi-contracts rather than the more historical traditional follow-up from offshore wind, running more towards one OEM and then run the contract. So maybe in a way we can help from the oil and gas side to develop an industry faster and in a more collaborative manner than what's been traditionally in offshore wind. Definitely, we cannot succeed alone, and we are mutually dependent, collaborating with each other, and then maybe we can grow a more diversified portfolio, making us less vulnerable and have more resilience in downturns, for example. So that's just a reflection from my side.
Oh, very interesting, Beate. Thank you. Maybe Jenneke, you have a comment to that as well.
Yeah, thanks. So I echo a lot of what's said by Beate and Olivier. So I'm very much aligned with that view. Maybe to add also and build upon what Olivier said about, we're as oil and gas companies not afraid to look at maybe structures from Asian countries or other supply chains. And I think that's also somewhere where we can play a role in bringing more competition also in the supply chain. So, for example, we do now see also Asian turbine suppliers that are establishing themselves in Europe, like Myking now in Germany and so on. So there's lots going on. And then it's, everybody's now looking, okay, who is the first kind of European party that is willing to try it with Asian turbines, for example. So, and I can imagine that as with jacket foundations and so on, the oil and gas are more willing and more capable maybe as well to manage those risks in working with other non-traditional supply chain companies.
Very interesting. I think we're always talking about local content requirements in offshore wind, as you've seen those in oil and gas, I think, as well. Does this mean that, and I would imagine that you have a lot of experience in terms of working with both global suppliers, but also global suppliers in addition, or local suppliers in addition to global suppliers, and developing the supply chain locally in addition to the global suppliers you have. Do you see this as an advantage for yourself in the offshore wind business? Is this something, lessons learned from oil and gas can be utilized in terms of how you build your supply chain, global, local, in combination? Is this something you can draw on from oil and gas? Do you believe? Anyone venturing?
Well, I think definitely we can do that. I don't see any mismatches in that way. I think we can build on our supply chains from oil and gas and over to offshore wind, and as I said, develop a kind of more resilience altogether.
Maybe what you see happening now is also that already proven concepts, maybe with low risks, are then transferred to new countries, like the monopile, traditional monopile foundation with the turbine on top. But maybe if the infrastructure is not there as such, or we've got different requirements with regards to piling due to environmental constraints or so on, we might need to think of different concepts as well, because installation methodologies are not set up, the harbors are not set up as such yet. So is the monopile then the best? Do we need to copy the industry from Europe to different countries? Do we want to do things differently? And I think this is somewhere where oil majors might feel more comfortable to think about other alternatives and developing also the industry together in a kind of cooperative manner. That makes sense.
Olivier, any comments? You mentioned cross-fertilization in terms of technology development. Is there any cross-fertilization in terms of supply chain management or processes in that direction?
Yeah, clearly, I had an example I wanted to share with you, but before, if you let me, that is a side comment on the topic of local content. I must say that I'm eager to see where the European countries are going to go in the next years, because at the same time we got pressure on the LCOE, and there are appetite for local content. But clearly we are no more in the days where countries were ready to pay subsidies in order to get industrial footprint in their country. So yeah, as Jenneke was saying, I'm not 100% sure that for European development, we are in the offshore wind business, we are going to get European development in the supply chain. So I'm pretty interesting to see how it's going to go in the next years in this local development, local content development. But
can I comment, please?
I think Olivier needs to finish first. I think you had another example there, Olivier. Then Giles, I'll put the word to you.
Yeah, and maybe the example I was intending to share was the suction buckets topic, which is a clear, so it's a bit technical topic, but so this is the type of foundation we have on Seagrid project with SSE in two things. The first one, they are built abroad, but also from a technological point of view, working for utility, I was looking at suction bucket as a fancy solution, rather unusual. And being an oil and gas player, yeah, suction bucket is something we use everywhere, not everywhere, but when it makes sense, and we don't see a technological risk in using suction buckets. So clearly, yeah, there are some cross-fertilization here.
And also between regions, I understand. Giles, please.
Forgive me, Olivier, interrupting you there. Wind Europe talked to governments all over Europe about offshore wind, and of course we talk very closely to the EU authorities. We have perceived in the last 2 or 3 years a shift in government thinking which has accelerated this year with COVID, and it's the following, that yes, there's still pressure on LCOE. Of course they want low costs, but there's much less pressure relatively from governments to reduce costs than there was 3, 4, 5 years ago. And there's a very strong recognition and a great welcome from governments in the success that the offshore wind industry, with the support of the oil and gas majors, has had in reducing LCOE. Where we now see relatively greater pressure from governments is on jobs in the offshore wind industry. Okay. Now, we know about the UK sector deal between the industry and the UK government. The UK government has promised to auction at least 2 gigawatts. That'll probably go to 3 gigawatts a year now of new capacity, in return for which the offshore wind industry promised to create 27,000 jobs by 2030 and to aim for 60% local content. The Polish government are looking to replicate that in parallel to their new offshore wind law that is going through their parliament as we speak, replicate it in some sort of government industry MOU or agreement. France has certain provisions still on local content. Other countries do not have, it is true. The Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, Germany, as things stand, do not have provisions on local content. Having said that, all of these countries that I've mentioned do want jobs and growth locally from the expansion of offshore wind, and they want exports as well. Okay. And the European Union supports the general notion that this huge expansion of offshore wind from 23 gigawatts to 450 gigawatts should be made in Europe. Okay, so, you know, we want this, we want the clean energy. Offshore wind is going to be the #1 source of electricity in Europe. It'll be 1/4 of our electricity by 2050. You will take up 3% of Europe's sea space, okay? And it's kind of the license to operate politically, as far as the EU sees it and national governments see it, that this creates jobs in Europe. So we have over 100,000 people working in offshore wind in Europe today. And the political ambition is for there to be many more than that. Now, of course, you know, your 3 companies, your commercial operators, you can buy turbines off anybody. I mean, that's absolutely fine. But my message to you is, please just bear in mind where the governments are coming from and where the EU are coming from politically on this.
Thank you, Giles, for that reminder. Of course, representing the Norwegian industry, I could say the same. And I think companies around the world who are all supporting offshore wind will have similar notions. Beate, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Giles, for bringing up this topic. And if we are going to succeed with the 450 gigawatts of offshore wind in Europe, how do you see the possibilities of collaboration across and versus the local requirements? Any thoughts around that?
So the collaboration is happening already.
Before you give an answer to that, Giles, just remind you we have a couple of minutes left. So a brief answer, please.
Yeah, the collaboration is happening between 9 governments around the North Sea. It's been happening for over 4 years now. It's pretty successful. They want to coordinate their grid investments, the timing and volumes of their auctions, their approach to maritime spatial planning, and the European Commission is supporting this. Unfortunately, the UK are no longer able to take part in this collaboration, and that's a matter of regret both to the UK and to the 9 national governments concerned. And you know, we hope something can be rescued there, but it is important and it needs to be replicated in the Baltic and elsewhere.
Thank you. And I think I need to thank all our panelists.
Ja, det ska jag göra. Jag bara väntar på
I think there are others who have to mute there somewhere. I think Marion is there. That's good. Now, thank you so much, Jenneke, Beate, Olivier, and Giles, for sharing your thoughts with us. It seems to me that there are a lot of room for cross-fertilization between companies, companies in the oil and gas industry, which are now entering offshore wind, between the utilities in the offshore wind sector, and also between countries in terms of how to learn and learn also from the oil and gas majors in terms of how you build your supply chain on a global basis, because there will be cross-fertilization between Europe and Asia and potentially Europe and the US, maybe both ways. Even though we are aiming to produce much in Europe, we could also learn from other areas or from other industries as we see it. And I think that's kind of underlining the discussion which we've had in terms of H&S, in terms of community engagement, in terms of maritime spatial planning, as well as in terms of how to build the supply chain. And thank you to the 3 of you from the oil and gas industry to elaborate on what you think about the way you enter the industry, about challenges and about advantages you see from your side. And thank you to you, Giles, for talking about how we can utilize the expertise of the oil and gas industry also in Europe to achieve those 450 gigawatt, and of course globally to achieve these, 1,000 to 1,500 gigawatt by 2050, if not more. So, and thank you to all the attendees for staying with us for an hour. Hopefully this was of interest to all of you as well. And I think we also have a discussion tomorrow, joint production between ONS, Norwegian Energy Partners, about technologies and technology transfer from oil and gas to offshore wind. Thank you to the four of you, and thank you to our attendees. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye to
Bye.
all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.